Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to this first afternoon session. My name is Nele, and I will be the chair of this very interesting panel, or what looks to be a very interesting panel on fiction and the role of fictioning in the practice of some researchers in the field of the arts. Fiction and the relation between fiction and reality, or between fiction and facts, facts being something very important in the world of science, is very complex, but it's a very interesting relation, particularly from the perspective of in the realm of the arts and arts research, or research in the arts. Fiction or fictional storytelling can indeed be a very powerful tool to reflect on reality, to reveal the complexity of reality, and even sometimes have an impact on it. Because contrary to what some definitions of fiction would suggest, fiction has everything to do with truth and reality. And one of my favorite quotes in this regard is from the Dutch author Simon Carmichael, who writes, "A writer lies the truth. A writer lies the truth." We all know that a fiction or a story arranges facts into a narrative, and sometimes even reshuffling them. And fiction is honest in that it doesn't claim to be telling the truth. Even if fiction belongs to the realm of the imaginative, or an imaginative realm, that doesn't mean that stories are inherently untrue. On the contrary, perhaps stories tell or reveal a deeper truth about the world in which we live. A deeper truth than, for instance, measurable facts or statistics. And particularly today, we all know, we all face daily the curves and figures of the corona infections. And actually, these figures, that kind of figures, only provide one perspective on the crisis we're globally living in. Fiction, and that is what I guess we're going to learn today as well, fiction can provide other narratives than the ones that are dominant in our history or in our media. They provide other perspectives on the reality we sometimes experience. It can open up the world. It can clarify it, can explain it. It can even question it. Fiction allows us to think up and imagine other realities and explore new perspectives, for instance, also on the future or on our history. Thus, fiction can pull us into the realm or the world of the possible, the thinkable, the speculative, which, not coincidentally, is also important in the world of science. Even solid scientists must have a visionary spirit and be able to think the impossible in order to then push the boundaries of, or the limits of our knowledge, or knowledge of reality. So, as you know, no hypotheses without imagination. No laboratory experiments without fictitious assumptions about reality. In short, fiction precedes facts. And that is what I wanted to add to introduce this panel. Fact and fiction are therefore not opposites. They are also in the scientific and the artistic realm closely interrelated. Without much further ado, I will introduce the first speaker of this panel, but I also wanted to say to the people at home that you can ask questions. So if you have questions to one of the three speakers this afternoon, you can ask them by the chat on the Facebook of this event, or the Facebook page of this event. Unfortunately, the chat for the YouTube channel does not function or is not open, but you can ask the questions and we will kind of try to get them through and pose them to the speakers. So, our first speaker of today is Goda Palekaité. She's an artist and social and cultural anthropologist. and currently also a PhD candidate at Hasselt University and PXL Mad School of Arts. In her projects, she explores the politics of historical narratives, the agency of dreams and imagination, and social conditions of creativity. She's currently based in Brussels, but has presented her work in many international venues and won also many prestigious prizes. Goda, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Nele, for such a nice and inspiring introduction on fiction. We can maybe start with the first slide. Well, so my name is Goda Palekaité, and I'm an artist and researcher working in the intersection of contemporary art, performance, literature, anthropology, and of course, artistic research. And yeah, as Nele introduced, I am at the moment a PhD candidate at the Hasselt University and PXL Mad School of Arts. And in my research practice, I attempt to open up the liminal spaces of the psyche and invite the viewers or the readers to encounter controversial historical figures. So I'm interested in how and if can artistic research disseminate counter-narratives to reshape the existing imbalanced historical discourses. And so for this, in the last years, I've been exploring, experimenting with, and employing the methods of fictioning, speculation, and forgery in my practice. And in this talk, I will show you 3 examples of historical characters and historical narratives that were very important and influential for my research practice and that appear in my performances and my exhibitions, and they are, I can say, my teachers, so they teach me how to fiction. Usually I start my research process from the so-called unreliable historical materials, or what I call historical leftovers. And these contain everything basically that doesn't fit the formal historiographic criteria and therefore has been neglected by the grand historical narratives such as somebody's dreams or visions or opinions, rumors, and so on. And so here you see the images from my performance dedicated to Mikhail Bakunin, a 19th century Russian anarchist who spread his ideas in political speeches and underground activities throughout Europe and who was prosecuted in every country he traveled to. He was also sentenced to death twice, but he managed to escape Russian Tsarist prison, where he actually before lost all his teeth from scurvy. And then he traveled to Siberia and the United States in order just to come back, to make the circle around the globe and to come back to Europe to continue his anarchist activities. And so he is a typical historical character that fascinates me. He appeared not only in this performance that was presented at the Venice Architecture Biennale and then later in Turin and in Vilnius, but he also appeared in 3 other works of mine, at least. However fascinating this sounds, what I'm telling you about Bakunin's life story, it is not based on so-called undeniable, reliable historical facts, but rather the historical material about Bakunin is very controversial, problematic, and usually politically very charged. So when I work with a figure like that, my intention is not to do some justice to Bakunin, but rather to use his voice, and through his voice, to trigger the imagination of contemporary audience in order to be able to reconsider the anarchist proposal, in this case, in today's context. And so therefore, when I write scripts for the performances, let's say, I do not try to stick to the facts that we find about him, but I dive straight into this liminal territory of knowledge, and I try to contribute to it by inserting my own inventions. The differentiation between fact and fiction can be seen itself as unreliable. For example, in the 16th and 17th century English literature, the term novel was used to talk about both real and fictional events and texts. For example, it was used to describe both a Decameron and a journalistic article. And it was interchanged with the word news. So both were used for supernatural events and for everyday life events. And so this distinction between fictionality and factuality as something that defines the genre of a piece of writing didn't exist until basically the 18th century in the English literature. And even more, the authors of English novels, they usually begin their writing saying that this, what they are now describing, is not at all fiction, but it's somebody's real life, and they were a witness of it. They use phrases such as far as I can remember, and so on. And so this is a technique of fictioning the facts, or also facting the fiction, which is also wide used in the arts today. I myself use the same strategy in my research practice, and here you can see 2 images from my exhibition, Legal Implications of a Dream, which was presented at Roar Gallery in Tel Aviv in 2018. I will talk about its contents in a minute, but for now I just want to draw your attention to these numerous artifacts which were exhibited leaving the ambiguity of their origin. So both the ancient archaeological artifacts were exhibited next to artifacts made by me, or sculptures, you could say, and they were contextualized in what was something like a manual, which also merged the scientific data and creative writing. This we can skip because I'm afraid we will run out of time. Okay, let's come back to the 17th century England, the interesting times when the brutal separation between the facts and fiction were not there yet. And one of the amazing writers of the 17th century England was Margaret Cavendish. You see an image on the right. She was the Duchess of Newcastle. She had no formal education because she was a woman, but she had certain status in the society because she was married to this rich and important Duke of Newcastle. And so their house was a place for the thinkers, writers, scientists, other kinds of intellectuals of the day to meet and to discuss the problems, the matters of the day. And so in this way, we can say she got educated by listening to these discussions and opinions and gossips and all that was going on, and she started writing. On the left side here, you see an image from my exhibition. The strongest muscle in the human body is the tongue, which is at the moment installed at the editorial project space in Vilnius. And actually, it's going to be presented at Kunsthal Gent in Ghent from the 21st of May. And so in this exhibition, I work with a Margaret Cavendish novel, The Blazing World, written in 1666, which now is often considered one of the first works of science fiction. So what Margaret does already in the 17th century is extremely avant-garde and interesting in many ways. So in her writings, she wildly connects the natural sciences of her day with philosophy, with speculative writing, with fantasy, and she doesn't stick to any rules, not even grammar. And with the excessive language, she addresses the issues that were not at all addressed in her day and which sound very contemporary to us. For example, we can hear something like an intuition for feminist or post-humanist ideas in her novel. And what particularly interests me is quite radical descriptions of the body. For example, here on the left side here is a detailed recipe how to turn an old, decayed man into a 20-year-old boy. I wanted to read it for you, but maybe if we have time later. Now, my contribution, working with such a character, was to act as an editor and as a translator. So Cavendish has never been translated to Lithuanian before, and the exhibition is first presented in Lithuania. And so this image that you see here is a 6-meter-long wall, which was designed in collaboration with the graphic designer Jonė Miškinytė. And half of these fragments are the English originals. Then if you look closely, there are lots of brackets in the text, which indicate my own intervention, so my attempt to condense the meaning. And the other paragraphs connected to the English ones are my translations to Lithuanian when I try to imitate Margaret's style and even repeat her ideas and weird phrasings and so on. So the graphic design itself it's of course an attempt to materialize this wildly moving text. So we can say that Margaret Cavendish is a visionary interdisciplinary artist employing the scientific facts and the method of fictioning and completely merging the facts and imagination in her work in order to create new worlds or to try to define the world that will come. And so David Burrows and Simon O'Sullivan in their book Fictioning, where they discuss fiction not as a genre, but just like us today as a method, they propose to see that fictioning is employed in art and in contemporary philosophy for visionary purposes. So in their words, it intends to describe the reality to come. Now, I'm also interested in employing fictioning and forgery also to describe the reality that could have come or should have come in the past. So this exhibition that already showed you pictures before derived from a 2-year-long research and dealt with the legacy of the ancient Khazar Empire that existed in between the Black and the Caspian Seas, and following a fatal king's dream mysteriously disappeared from the world map around the 10th century. And supposedly dreams and imagination played a prominent role in the Khazar Empire, and supposedly their legal and administrative system ensured equal rights and equal representation of all the diverse ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups living there, which was many, and which is, of course, unique in the times when the huge monotheistic empires are raising their powers. So for me, it was extremely interesting to discover that and to speculate what the world would be if it had taken the Khazar path. But, of course, the historical and archaeological sources in this case also are limited, contradictory, and used by different groups of interests for their purposes. So my own interest in the Khazar story derived from a novel written by a Serbian author, Milorad Pavic, called Dictionary of the Khazars. And there he describes the 3 possible histories of the empire. And he combines vast historical and archaeological research on Khazar studies with poetic writing. So my research began with a fictional book, which led me to read a bunch of scientific sources and finally to go on 2 research trips. The first one to the Caucasus region, nowadays Russia and Georgia, where the Khazars actually lived, and the second to Israel, where the Khazar legacy has a lot of influence. And so in the Caucasus, I met with Khazar scholars and archaeologists, and I even received these 1,000-year-old artifacts that you see here, which supposedly belong to the Khazar period. But it was not strictly ethnographic fieldwork. I also observed and photographed landscapes and recorded the songs and stories told by people who live there and who know nothing about the Khazars, for example. And I collected also my own subjective ideas and impressions. And then I came back again to the novel by Milorad Pavic and interpreted it through my own personal experiences that appeared to me somewhat Khazarian. So here, for example, on the right side, you see an artifact, a screw from the USSR, which I found in a loaf of bread baked by my grandfather, who was a mechanic and a baker in the USSR, and I exhibited it along with the 1,000-year-old artifacts. So the first outcome of this both fictional and real research was this exhibition, and the second was this book that you see here. It's called Schismatics. It's been published last year by a publishing house, Lapas. And it consists of 11 biographies, fictional biographies of historical characters. Only 2 of them are related to the Khazar story, but it was through this research on the Khazars that I started actually developing the methodology that I'm describing today and that continues through my work. And so now to conclude, I just show you all the characters that appear in the book, and it means that they are all characters of my research. So there is the Khazar princess Ate, Mikhail Bakunin that I talked about today, the Greek poetess Sappho, Saint Thecla, Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, French anthropologist Michel Herries, and others. So I will finish here, and I'm very much looking forward to my colleagues' presentations, and I hope we will have a nice and interesting discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Goda. This looks like a very interesting material to discuss indeed more in detail afterwards. But I first give the floor to Charlotte Vanhoubroeck. She's an art historian and a jewelry artist, and currently also a PhD candidate at Hasselt University and PXL MAD School of Arts, with funding from the FWO. Charlotte specialized in fashion and jewelry history of the Romantic era. She more specifically performed research on the royal wardrobe of the first queen of the Belgians, Louise Marie d'Orléans. Her research focuses on the lost sentimental jewelry of the queen, and she tries to reactivate it from a contemporary point of view. And in doing so, she hopes to bring this nearly forgotten queen, we have to be honest, whom Charlotte has developed a personal affinity with. In the meantime, she tries to bring this closer to today's audience. Charlotte, I'm very curious to hear more about this project.
Thank you, Nele, for introducing me so nicely. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. And yes, so I'm Charlotte, as already mentioned. I'm working on a PhD in the arts at Beekstel School of Arts. And yes, today I will present you my research and talk to you about my methods, my ways of working. And as the first slide is already showing, is the presentation showing? Yeah, there it is. Okay, thank you. So as the slide shows, this research focuses on the sentimental Jewry of Louise Marie d'Orléans. Now, as Nele already mentioned, she was the first queen of the Belgians. Some of you might know her, some of you might not. She's somehow a very forgotten woman who lived during the Romantic era, an era I'm really fond of. And she was known to be a kind, melancholic woman, and we could say that her large yet humble jewelry collection was a proof of that. And every piece of this collection is written down in Louise's estate inventory, and this document was drawn up after Louise's death in 1850 and lists almost 300 jewelry pieces. And more than 100 of these jewelry pieces are so-called sentimental jewelry pieces, and those pieces commemorate family and other loved ones. Like you can see here, this portrait detail, here Louise is wearing a sentimental piece, namely a bracelet showing a miniature portrait of her husband, King Leopold I. So we could say that sentimental jewelry can be defined as jewelry that encapsulates a memory or a sentiment. The typical sentimental jewelry components at that time were, for instance, these miniature portraits. Sometimes names, initials, or sentimental messages were engraved into the piece, and also very sentimental components were locks of human hair. Now, since, unfortunately, hardly any jewelry of Louise has survived, and with the exception of a few portraits, like you can see here, there is almost no detailed information of her jewelry left, and that's why this inventory is an incredibly valuable and interesting document for further research. Because after all, just as the sentimental jewelry at the time captured the sentiments of Louise, both literally and figuratively, in this very same way, the inventory now captures the sentimental jewelry. Now, in other words, the inventory is the only place where Louise's pieces are preserved. And based on this inventory, the sentimental jewelry and Louise's sentiments, it is my intention to retell the myth of Louise Marie d'Orléans. She's an almost forgotten woman whose story got entangled in gender stereotypical cliches, and I feel this urge to revise that. Now, in order to retell this myth, there will be a permanent interaction. There is a permanent interaction between theoretical research and artistic practice. And first, this research moves into the theoretical field of memory studies, a field that examines the importance of memory in the academic discourse. And more specifically, my research links up with material memory studies. It's a subdomain, so to speak, that investigates how memories are hidden in the material world around us, such as objects, such as, for instance, here in jewelry pieces. Now, since Louise since Louise herself becomes an entity that is remembered and constructed in the course of this research, questions arise about who she was as a princess, who she was as a queen, a wife, a mother, and so on. And my research ties in with the ongoing research into the imaginary construction of female sovereignty. Now, this theoretical analysis is also the stepping stone for artistic creation, because, as I already mentioned, almost all of Louise's jewelry got lost over time, and that might discourage the historian, but will inspire the artist. So what this research will mainly try to do is something that is theoretically not possible, and that is regenerating what is lost. And this is where fictioning comes in, of course. And so I use these fictioning and speculative thinking strategies, and via these research methods, seemingly fixed truths can be revised via alternative narratives, as already has become clear. So to return to this overview for a second, so will the absence of the actual jewelry, like the lack of visual evidence, invite the artist to imagine, to recreate, to reactivate the jewelry of Louise Marie d'Orléans from a contemporary viewpoint. And therefore, I will use a process I call confabulation method. Now, this term originates from the medical field. People who suffer from memory problems can sometimes, in very specific cases, confabulate, and that means that they unconsciously fill in gaps in their memory with completely fictional information, completely made-up information. So it is quite tragic, but in a very weird way, also fascinating, I have to admit. And so important in this method, if it comes to the research, is that the maker starts from actual, tangible historical material, which, however, inevitably leaves gaps in a way. And the historical material on which this research is based is Louise's estate inventory, which describes very beautifully, but does not visualize. Now, so automatically this method starts with a linguistic phase, you could say. And here, this fragment, number 16, shows an example of the description, the 16th description in the inventory. Here you can see the transcription, and it's of course in 19th century French, so I might just help you out and give you an English translation. And so this number 16 is a brooch in the form of a knot or a bow or some kind of ribbon hanging, and it has a whole gold heart for a pendant enriched with precious metals, precious stones, and this heart can be opened, and it contains a king's eye. Like the eye miniatures were just like portrait miniatures, really popular in romantic jewelry pieces, sentimental jewelry. It's typical for loved ones, a really intimate type of sentimental jewelry piece. What I try to do here when I see these kind of these descriptions, somehow certain components kind of pop out, and during the confabulation, each component is actually linguistically explored. It kind of triggers this stream of consciousness. For instance, like Princess Charlotte. Why is she involved in this description? Who is she? Is she the person who inherited the piece? I found out she's Louise's daughter, of course, and she was only 10 years old when her mother died. And I thought this was a really interesting element that could add to the story. And also, of course, my very own name is Charlotte, and that makes it also interesting because now somehow I found like this little loophole where I can involve myself into the whole remaking of this piece. Secondly, there's a brooch in the form of a knot, and this form of a knot or a bow or a ribbon, like in translations, some things get lost, so a knot or a bow, it kind of triggered this wordplay, and not knots, and not ties, a tie knots, and all of those ideas. And if you relate it to the idea of a brooch, you actually realize that a brooch is something that is knotted and tied to the clothing. So this decorative element can inspire me to think through technicalities of the piece. How will the brooch system be? Like you will see a bit further on. And then heart for a pendant. Here I was still thinking about Charlotte, about her being a child that lost her mother very soon, and I was wondering what kind of heart would Charlotte like to receive? What kind of heart is fitted for a child? So that's also that you'll see solved. Now sometimes it also happens that some components just don't trigger anything. I'm not really intrigued by the elements that talk about that kind of represent wealth, that represent status, like precious stones, precious metals, those. And then I just kind of accept that because for me it's all about the sentiment. It's all about the biographical information of Louise's story, really, and that's not in this these wealthy components. So I just accept that and do nothing with it, really. Then art, which can be opened. This opening contains this kind of element of surprise, and so you can think about opening, closing, hiding, showing, playing. I also want Charlotte to play with it, so why not make sure this is something to be played with, this piece. And then the king's eye, so the eye miniature of the king. The eye is something that is really intriguing contemporary artists until today. It has this voyeuristic symbolism, so there's lots to do about it, and also just the word "I" on itself, you can represent it by one letter, the letter I, and this letter I might just look like an L, and this I and this L can represent Leopold I, or it can stand for Louise, or why not me, I myself. So here I am again, involved in the whole thing. So this is just how this. Brainstorming, this stream of consciousness comes loose, and it can go on as far as I want it to go, really. And these little books kind of contain the first brainstorms. You can see on the second page there is number 16, where I first started exploring the piece. And then a few weeks later, I decided to continue with the piece, and I started to play with materials. So after the linguistic phase, there comes a material thinking. So the language becomes more visual. Certain objects and materials are considered. Techniques are thought through. And here you can see how I started playing with the possibility of using a little Polly Pocket Locket, like a little toy from the 90s. Some of you might remember it. I was certainly very fond of it as a child. So now and then, again, a few weeks later, here's a spread that kind of tries to find out a few more technicalities, like the brooch system. And then I was, like I already mentioned, it's linked to the idea of the knot or the bow. Kind of visualize. Yes, my interpretation of that. And then eventually we have this Polly Pocket heart, which is linked to a really abstracted bow or knot, or which is tied to the clothing, and you can untie it by pulling out the pin. And when you open it, you have this pink surprise, and also the child has the ability to play with it by placing an eye in the piece. So the eye can stand for a lot of things, and the wearer can choose what it eventually becomes. So here is a really in-depth analysis of one piece. I could go through with many other pieces. The storylines are very different, so this isn't just the method, but it's just one way of working I can show. And then, for instance, there is this number 49, which which was described as a portrait of a king surrounded with brilliants. And again, I wasn't really intrigued by the brilliants because they represent too much status. I'm just going to leave them out and leave the settings, because like unfinished settings of the stones, they kind of have this, they do look like crowns and align with the idea of kingship. And that's how this piece kind of happened. That's just the way of putting it. And then another piece, also interesting, is number 163, described as a brooch in the shape of a bird, and it had a heart dangling from its beak. Now the bird became a stuffed wing, and the heart became the stuffed bird sparring, and which was hidden inside the medallion at the back. And it's really interesting because here, through the whole confabulation process, Louisa got lost on the way, actually. It suddenly was all about the bird. And this wasn't my intention, but somehow your gut kind of leads you to do those things. And then number 267 were 3 medallions, each were depicting an eye miniature of each of Louise's children. And so I made 3 neck pieces, can be worn separately or together. And each piece shows facial elements, facial features, and when combined, a new individual is created in the combined piece a new individual that's actually a child of Louise and me, where her face and my face are morphed, like both like in a technical matter, but also computer-wise. So I can tell you a lot more about many pieces. Unfortunately, there's no time for that. You can ask questions, of course, later on, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, the little discussion we'll have later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And I'll have to invent now a virtual applause. But there's nobody in the room. But I imagine that people at home are very enthusiastic. I hope they are as I am. But before we ask you questions, I think we need to listen to Laura first. Laura is Laura Vandewynckel is. They have to change places first. Is our third speaker of the panel. She is a theater and filmmaker living in Brussels. She graduated from Ritz School of Arts with a stop-motion short Paradise in 2014, which was a critical reflection on the ethics of tourism. The film got selected for the Cine Fondation Cannes and Toronto International Film Festival. Laura explores in her research, because that's like important to mention, of course, as well. She's also a PhD candidate, as the two other panelists, a PhD researcher in the fields of the arts at Ritz and VUB, investigating automata as a trigger for social change. And more generally, or more broadly speaking, Laura explores hybrid forms in which fiction, documentary, live animation, and theater intertwine. Laura, that's very promising. I hope in the meantime the presentation is ready, and you are too? Yeah, here you are.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Maybe I can start with the very beginning. As a child, I loved shoeboxes, and especially for the things that I could hide inside. When I was 13, I cried for 5 days when I lost my dinosaur. On the 5th day, I heard its pooing sound in the cupboard, and I was so happy. When I was 23, my heart broke in pieces when I had to break in pieces my animation puppets. They were built on the armatures of the school, and I had to give those back for future students to work with. So I organized a ritual bye-bye photo shoot with that perverse god creature and the little boy. It was only when I turned 33 that I became serious about things. I started a PhD about what the hell is it that makes us so mad about dead, lifelike objects. The power of objects is known since the beginning of man, but the why and how questions haunt us up until today. It is relevant in robotics, computer sciences, engineering, design, architecture, politics, marketing, religion, ecology. But what makes non-living things so powerful? And if they are so powerful, how can we use them to make a change? I wanted to better understand, as a theater and animation filmmaker, how I could create dead, lifelike objects that would affect us and console us, but also encourage us towards more thoughtful, social, empathic, and ethical behavior. Very ambitious. The first part of my research is a general investigation in thing power. What qualities make an object more affectable, powerful than another object? And what can objects achieve what humans cannot? In the second part of my research, I applied general insights to a specific social artistic goal. Due to a personal crisis, I grow extremely fascinated by scapegoat mechanisms. In a nutshell, the scapegoat mechanism is the unconscious psychological tendency to shift the responsibility of our frustrations to a marginal other. We blame the other, make them a monster, and exclude them, so we feel better. I wanted to investigate how I could use objects as a method to learn more about the scapegoat mechanism and to make us, again, conscious about it. I also wanted to find out if these objects could be used as a harmless outlet for our frustrations, and if they could answer our need for consolation and belonging. But what do I mean with an object? And what object is the focus of my research? You can spend a lifetime clarifying the difference between object, thing, human, non-human, animal, agent, life form, animated object, automaton, wonder, puppet, robot, kinetic sculpture. But the most important for me is this. In Western philosophy, there always has been a clear distinction between a superior human subject, on the one hand, and an inferior non-human world of animals and objects, on the other hand. And the non-human world only exists because we humans perceive it, is only valuable if we humans can use it, and is totally under our control. That was the vision. But in recent philosophy, this worldview has become highly contested. In a drastically changing natural environment and with technology penetrating our daily lives, we touch upon the borders of our control. We can no longer view ourselves as the puppeteers of the object world. In fact, we are no more puppeteer than puppets played by the non-human forces around us. Forest fires, rubbish, invasive animals, viruses, artificial intelligence, social media, they have an effect on us as much as we have an effect on them. What's even more, we can no longer see us separate from these entities. We are entangled with them in complex networks of meaning. And secondly, for the title of my research, I did not use the word object. I wanted to use a concept by Aristotle. In his metaphysics, Aristotle refers to ton, taumaton, taumata, as things that inspire metaphysical curiosity. Tauma means wonder. Automaton means self-moving. So Aristotle is actually referring here to automatic marionettes and says, the same way we are puzzled by and inquire about these automatic puppets, we wonder and learn why all things are as they are. And I love this idea of automatons that bewonder us and make us wonder. And my research had to be about them, about animated, inanimate objects, robots, puppets, and kinetic sculptures that invade the public space, and the encounter with them is sudden and ephemeral. The spectator is bewildered and encouraged to interact and reflect. So now I'm going to present you the Scapegoat projects, where theory and practice meet. In 2016, I was invited to create a short film on the Greek island Sifnos in 10 days. The idea of the film was inspired by this devastating personal experience I was very embarrassed about. In those sad months, I had grown a larger than normal interest in guilt. And being a complete atheist, I envied people who found consolation in rituals. I had none. I chanced upon a very interesting ritual which appeared to have taken place around the 6th century before Christ in Athens and other towns in the Mediterranean region. And that was the pharmakos ritual. It went like this. So in times of war, drought, and crisis, the ancient Greek chose two useless humans to transfer their burdens upon. This ritual was called pharmakos, and pharmako in ancient Greek means both medicine, so it's healing, but also poison. It's, causing the problem. For my Greek film, I wanted to bring the ancient pharmakos victims back to life in the shape of two human-like objects. I wanted them to meticulously reenact the archaic ritual as described by the historians together, and this together with the people of Sifnos. Could these object beings learn us something about this problematic scapegoat mechanism and make us reflect upon our responsibility in that case, or in actual cases? Still home, I started creating the scapegoats. And it had to look as if the human objects were autonomous, real humans. So my friend Nienke Deutsch and I bought high-end camouflage outfits to blend in the Greek surrounding. No one would ever notice there were 2 humans involved in the sacred event. And there we went, packed with limbs and heads, flying to Sifnos. And this is how the film and the performance was set up. So the pharmaki, they collected the stones onto which the people of Sifnos would write their problems. They dragged the poles onto which they would be hung. Before being sacrificed, the ancient pharmaki would be treated on a very good meal and a good sleep. And in the early morning, outside the walls of the polis, they would be beaten up and stoned to death. The Sifnos experience had a big impact on me, and more than I could expect, also on the people of Sifnos. The people there had seen us parading with these puppets back and forth on the island, and they made a lot of fun about us. But unconsciously, they had also started to like these clumsy, ugly puppets. And when the moment had come of the ritual, and they were invited to throw their burden stone onto the puppets, it for some reason felt strange. On the one hand, it felt like a relief to kick these objects brutally hard and get rid of the stone that had carried their burden. But on the other hand, it felt very uncomfortable to hurt these innocent puppet creatures. And apart from that, I found out that the presence of these puppets had triggered many opinions and testimonies. The people of Sifnos felt invited to share their story and ventilate their concerns. From these testimonies, we gathered that the guilty had many faces. It's politicians, it was the migrants, it was tourists. So each story gave another identity to our carte blanche scapegoats. So based on this experience, I concluded that our puppets had a versatile potential. They created a sort of forum for exchange, and they themselves became containers of meaning. They became the pivot of an interaction ritual. I was convinced the Greek experience was only the beginning of a longer scapegoat exploration, and back home I dived fully into the subject. So the idea was to each time retell a myth from the perspective of the scapegoat. I collected myths worldwide, ancient myths, actual myths told by citizens, politicians, leaders, media, individuals. And so we would collectively retell them from the perspective of the scapegoat. The scapegoat is represented by an automaton, which is built, voiced, and manipulated by the participants. Through the reenactment of the myth, we visualize the complex network of responsibilities. And through the reenactment, we hope to create a new and harmless kind of ritual where people can meet and vent their frustrations. In 2018, I traveled to Brazil, the Bahian island Itaparica, for an artist residency. Already upon arrival, I was amazed by a peculiar phenomenon. In the middle of the grass, overgrown streets, hardly visible in the shade of the lights, horses would emerge. And they stood still and they stared at you. Later on, I learned the story about these horses, but I will show a snippet of my trailer so you can see them.
Essa é a nossa ilha. Promessas sem palavra, promete emprego, promete melhoras e, no entanto, não tem nada.
Eu vivia naquele nervo, aquele negócio. Aí eu fiz uma promessa, quando eu saísse dali não voltava mais, nunca mais. Quando ele chegava na dele, na roça dele, ele dava uns tiros, disse que era para os bandidos saber que ele estava ali. Aí tudo isso vai tirando a graça da pessoa.
Sorry, I'm skipping here just to make sure I'm not speaking too long. So the 7th of January, I attended the speech by the mayor of Itaparica. She gave an invigorating speech on the occasion of Itaparica's Independence Day, and she was rightly proud of her accomplishments and fully aware of the big challenges she and her team face in Itaparica. After an enumeration of problems, she said, "We have a lot of problems, but what really makes our throats thick is those horses in the street, and I am not afraid to talk about it." I had marveled at these beautiful fairy tale-like horses, so for me as an outsider, it was absolutely hard to understand why these horses were a problem. I asked around and heard that they were a true nuisance. They invade houses, they leave the streets filthy, they cause car accidents, and when they die, they often linger there for a very long time. It felt strange to hear the horses being mentioned in the same breath with public health issues, drugs violence, and poverty. So I was wondering whether the horses maybe were the only problem that could be tackled. In any case, removing horses is way easier than tackling persistent poverty and violence. I assumed that their removal would mean a lot to the people of Itaparica, who told me to be fed up with the inertia of Brazil government and the lack of prospects. So I wanted to further explore this assumption and discover the complex network of responsibilities in which these scapegoated horses became entangled. And back home, from the residency, me and Maarten Dirks, we started building our scapegoat in the shape of an automaton. We wanted to translate these damned horses in something that would be very affectable but also monstrous at the same time. Something that was between a human, an animal, and a plant. And I will quickly show you the making of procedure. We were very much inspired by Theo Jansen, and we wanted to use his system of movement in the legs. And we also checked a very lively face, ears that could turn and listen to the sound. And well, I'm not such a good planner, so the 4 legs the idea of 4 legs had to be abolished. So we decided to make a 2-legged horse. And I saw it existed, so I felt consoled. As production issues made it impossible to go back to Itaparica, we wanted to check out our horse, so we thought if we can't go to Brazil, let's go to Jet in Brussels and explore what the horse scapegoat can do. Of course, it is totally irrelevant. Horses in Jet, it's a totally other story. But even then, we were really happy with what we have experienced there. So I'm going to show a little snippet of it. and then I have spoken. So I skip to here. Okay, I have to, it's still 7 more minutes, so that's for another time, I think. But it was a very interesting thing, because each time we told the people from Jet, like, this is a horse, and if you have something that is burdening your shoulders, give it to the horse, because horses take sorrows, and so you can free yourself. And the discussions that evolved were very interesting, which you can hear later in this piece. But we hope to go back to Brazil soon and do this collective interaction ritual soon. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. And again, I have to invite the people at home to give a virtual applause to Laura and to other speakers. It is a wonderful panel. I think although the projects and the people are very different, they are very, I see a lot of connections, and it resonates in many ways the way you work or approach things, and particularly, of course, on fiction and fictioning as a way to either productively make sense of the gaps or objects that are missing, or to create counter-narratives, or to deal with, or to provide counter-stories, counter-narratives to react to dominant narratives or historical narratives, or in the case of Laura, of course, also to switch perspective and away a bit from the anthropocentric worldview, right? So there's a lot of, I think, a lot of things we can discuss. We have time for questions now, but I'll wait if there's questions coming from the people at home. But maybe I can ask and start with a question for the three of you. where to start. I mean, you all, in a way, were talking about agency and giving agency to either objects, or you talk about agency of a dream, or maybe the archival objects. And I was wondering, since it is a day on methodology and methods in artistic research, I was wondering, I tried to imagine in a concrete way, how do you deal with these objects, and how do you, in a way, create this dialogue with the objects, or with these, how do you take them seriously? Because if I understand it correctly, you take these objects very seriously, and you even allow objects, and then also in a sense of archival objects, you allow them in a way to speak back, to not only just project your own fictional ideas on the object, but you kind of try to give them a voice themselves, if I can say it like that. So I invite the three of you to either respond or to reflect on this idea. Goda, do you want to start, or depends on?
Well, just to react spontaneously, I have to think immediately about, well, my objects that we're talking about are historical characters and historical narratives mostly. So it's usually not about the objects like a piece of a clay or something like that I exhibit, but it's about the discourses that they open, and narratives that they guide us to. And in the agency comes in the game for me in a form of trying to discover possibilities for intimacy. So I think I work with historical characters and narratives in a very intimate, very personal way. So let's say when I want to talk about Michel Laris, who was a French writer and anthropologist from the colonial era, and who traveled to Dakar Djibouti mission in the 30s, and there it was a huge colonial expedition organized by the French state. And there he encountered the horrors of colonialism without actually having the discourse, the background to think about it yet. And he started describing it through the descriptions of his nightmares and dreams and psychotic episodes that he experienced, and then he decided to publish it when he came back to France, along with the basically colonial crimes that were committed in the mission and where he participated at. So this is it's a liminal, and it's a very ambiguous, ambivalent, very problematic territory that he appeared at. And when I'm trying to activate him, when I'm trying to work with him, I'm searching for a similar experience or similar territory in my own experience. So I'm maybe looking through my own diaries or, dreams, fantasies, and so on, and trying to create this, it's not even creating, it's, activating this intimate relationship with the character. No, so I think, the agency, it goes through the intimacy.
Mm-hmm. And in the interaction, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Laura?
Yeah. Well, indeed, I think the agency is actually our agency. It's because they are containers, they're so blank, and if we're taking them serious, we take ourselves serious, because it's we that bring them to life. But what I think is really important or interesting is that we don't take, in my case, we don't take them serious at the same time, because they're just objects. And I think especially, or exactly this clash between they're absolutely interesting and important because they reflect what we have projected onto them. And on the other hand, they're just stupid objects that are made from material and tissue. There is the power. And we can take a distance from them, so we get more overview. Actually, puppets are also used, or objects are used in therapy for children, adults, because they enable you to put your life and your opinions and thoughts outside of you. And so you start to play your own life, and you get an insight into it. And you're very serious about that, but at the same time you think, yeah, they're just mere objects. So it is a story, it is not me. Yeah, this is where, in this zone, I try to swim.
Mm-hmm. So you consider objects more, or the objects you work at least with, the puppets, which are in a way very anthropomorphic still. They are very human-like. You still consider them as a kind of reflection of what the people who are looking at, well, for the people who are looking at them, for their thoughts and feelings, rather than that they have a voice of their own, let's say.
Well, they bring, for instance, the horses, they carry so many thoughts. A horse in Itaparica is a totally other horse than a horse in Jet, so there is something coming from them that we can never predict or... So yeah, but I'm very much in vital materialism now, and it's a world I'm just about to discover, and there's this quest: what is it? What is the agency of an object, and how can we know that this object has an agency? Because the only thing, or the only way to know it is our own brain. So what are we projecting, and what is coming out from that thing itself? It's a very tough one, of course, but maybe next year I can speak more about that.
And I think Charlotte as well can connect to that. I mean, the jewels are also, well, the jewels that aren't there anymore. You have to reinvent them, but then in a way it's also about
yes, and of
projection,
course,
maybe.
Like just all the Romantic era, like in the 19th century, and even before then, this just knowing what objects meant back then have meant all that time. It teaches us how people really depend on the meaning of objects. It's like, especially if you talk about sentimental jewelry, those are pieces, precious pieces that, okay, there are stones, there might be gold in it, there might be stones on it, but especially the little portrait, the lock of hair that's in there, it's such a heavy piece and it's like it carries this weight that cannot be worn by the person just itself. So it needs this object to carry these kind of emotional stories, these events, and just this historical knowledge makes me, like today, respect the idea, the agency of an object so intensely. And even when I read descriptions in the inventory, I already treat the language as objects to come. So it's almost like through this confabulating and through this whole process that I let it come to me, and I of course there are gaps and there is lacking information, so I need to add a little bit here and there, and I need to build it up and make it a bit more firm. That's how I see it, but actually, like, the essence of the object is actually already there in the description, like the heaviness of it. And that's why I think objects are so, like, especially the jewelry it's tiny, but it's huge at the same time.
And these objects that you are talking about in the sentimental jewelry, they are usually something related to the body, right? They are not some random objects. They are the painting of somebody's eye or the lock of the hair. So they are very anthropomorphic objects at the same time.
Yes, it really shows the human need to hold it against them. Like, even men in the Romantic era, men weren't really allowed to show off with jewelry, but they still carried it underneath their clothing. So there was no show off anymore, but there was still this need to have it there with them. Like the eye, especially the eye, it kind of looks you right in the face. The lock of hair is the only thing that is like there between life and death. So it still lives on even if the person that had the hair once is dead. So they're like really little relics, and they're like really secular relics, you could say. So secular relics.
Relic is also very interesting. I think I was looking a bit into relics in relation to Christian mysticism and Christian tradition. And the relic is, in Christian terms, it's such an interesting object because generally in the tradition, the body is something that is totally, hidden, prohibited to talk about. And then there is a relic, which is usually somebody's, a piece of a body. The head of Saint Caterina is in one city, and the body is in another city, because the cities, the churches, they cannot agree where she belongs. Or the hand is sometimes in one altar, and the finger is in another. So every church in Christian world basically has a piece of a saint body, which is kind of the founding stone of it. And it made me think, your work made me think about that.
No, it has like this really religious atmosphere. This really
fetishized, extremely fetishized.
Like it's more than cherishing it only. Like no, that's true. That's true. I also feel it that way. So.
Okay, we have one question from the Facebook page coming from Sebastien Gdech. I hope I pronounced it correctly, and I think I would like to ask it and maybe try to get 3 brief answers, because we're almost a bit running out of time. The question is on our contemporary situation. We're living at the role of fiction and the power of fiction in what is today called the post-truth era. We have to deal with alternative facts, and the idea of alternative facts become very dangerous nowadays. And the question from Sebastien is, where do we go from here as a society? Are we sticking now to these facts, or how to? And that's a phrase I had to write down. How to live beautifully in an art or in anarchistic imagination? Is there for fiction a role maybe to play to deal with this very dominant, post-truth metaphor that is now in our society? I'm trying to interpret maybe the question too much now, but maybe you don't need to react, the 3 of you, if it's just one person or 2 wants to respond.
Well, it's a big question, but of course, I think that speaking about truth is already so problematic. As you said, for instance, about Corona, there's one vision on it. It's the scientific vision, but it's also, maybe you could also call it a myth, which it can be, it can be proven wrong, because science is always in continuation. And maybe the most healthy thing is to think about everything as myths, because that's a process. A myth is always something that you have to explore further and further and further, and you can never satisfy with, this is truth, this is like it is. So fiction is like sort of the starting point of reflecting, of being critical, that's...
Yeah, I think this reflecting is actually the main reason why fictioning is so important these days, because you kind of offer your public, or everyone really, this new world, not really just another truth, but this new world when people can place themselves in, and then from that world they can look to other worlds and other perspectives and other realities, and just experience everything completely differently. And that's, for me, that's the power of fiction. So, yeah.
Well, I can just maybe add that the problems that we have now, usually, if we look a bit deeper, we discover that they are not new at all. And this, apocalyptic view of the world that we like to imagine as something very contemporary. It was always there as long as the humanity exists. There were apocalypses of the times, and everybody was waiting for the, religion to collapse, the science to collapse, the all kinds of dominant discourses to collapse. And if I understood, I don't know if I understood correctly, but there was something like how to live beautifully in the...
Yeah, in anarchistic imagination was the phrase. How, as a question, how to live beautifully in anarchistic and
Anarchistic.
or anarchic, imagination.
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I don't think to live beautifully has anything to do with to live with some, sense of reality.
Thank you very much, Goda. That was, I think I need to, again, invent an applause. It is a bit weird in this empty theater, a large theater, which really invites, it would be great to have people around to really give a warm applause. I'll do it imaginatively, virtually with the people at home now. And as I understood it correctly, we have a break until 3:15. That's right. Thank you once more, the three of you. It was really great, and I think we will find ways to continue the discussion maybe later.